Tear it all out. Every rose, every stone, every tree.
That's what the HOA president screamed at the Bobcat operator standing in my dead wife's memorial garden. I was in Charlotte that weekend. By Sunday night, the half-acre garden was 4 feet of churned mud. Maeve had built it over 12 years. The reflecting pool we'd blessed our rings in was full of snapped fir branches. Her grandmother's heirloom rose, carried from County Cork in 1928, lay in the dirt. That woman thought she'd buried me with the garden. She didn't know I had spent 28 years as a senior FDIC bank examiner. Within 72 hours, I'd have the IRS, the state auditor, and the sheriff at her doorstep. They'd be pulling every transaction in the account she'd hidden in her own name. So I didn't drive over. I didn't shout. I sat on the broken bluestone with Maeve's gardening gloves in my lap and started writing the case file. Tell me below, would you have stopped her or let the soil keep the receipts? My name is Hollis Vance, and I live on a 3-acre patch of mountain ground at the head of Settlers Creek in Buncombe County, North Carolina, about 20 minutes outside Asheville. My grandfather Lonnie Vance bought the parcel in 1953 with money he saved building roads for the Civilian Conservation Corps. He cleared the front pasture by hand. He set the foundation stones for the house himself the spring my father was born. The land has been in my family ever since. I spent 28 years as a senior bank examiner with the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, out of the Atlanta Regional Office. I specialized in fraud detection at small community banks across the Southeast. It was the unglamorous work of finding the one wrong number on page 237 of a call report. You pulled on the thread until the whole sweater came apart. After I retired from the FDIC, I spent 7 more years in private practice doing forensic accounting. 9 months ago, I closed the consultancy and came home to my mountain to garden full-time. My wife Maeve passed 4 years ago of glioblastoma. She was an obstetrics nurse at Mission Hospital in Asheville for 31 years and a North Carolina master gardener for 20. We never had children of our own. The garden was our child. Maeve started the half-acre memorial garden the spring after we lost our second pregnancy in 1995. She kept building it for the rest of her life. She hand-laid every bluestone path. She designed the reflecting pool in pencil on graph paper at our kitchen table over 2 winters. She built the cedar arbor with her father the summer before he died. She planted an heirloom old shrub rose her grandmother had carried from County Cork in 1928. The bed was hand-built at the center of the garden. She set it the year we moved into the house. For the 4 years since Maeve's passing, I have tended that garden every morning and every evening. I took the Master Gardener course at the Buncombe County Extension Office in her honor. I pruned the roses on the schedule she had taught me. I cleaned the reflecting pool with a soft brush and rainwater. That was how she had wanted it cleaned. The garden was, in its modest way, the part of her I still got to keep. The HOA showed up in 2009. Riverbend Farms began as 140 lots on the 800 acres surrounding mine. It grew over 15 years into a 240-lot upscale mountain subdivision. It had its own clubhouse, swim center, and a stone monument at the front entrance bearing the name in carved Tuscan font. My grandfather had refused to sell our 3 acres to the developer. 2 more refusals followed under my father, and then under me. The HOA absorbed every road around the property except mine. My drive comes off Old Settlers Creek Road, which is a county road, not a community road. My deed predates the entire subdivision by 56 years. Brielle Castor moved into 312 Mountain Laurel Lane in 2018. Late 40s, blonde, athletic in the way of women who own 4 sets of yoga clothes for different temperatures. She drove a champagne Lexus GX460. She introduced herself by walking up my driveway one Saturday morning with a homemade lavender sachet and a copy of the Riverbend Farms HOA bylaws. She offered to help me catch up on all the community participation expectations I had missed. I told her my property wasn't part of her HOA. She smiled and told me, in a voice I would learn very well, that we'd see about that. She was elected HOA president in 2020. The first compliance notice arrived in February of last year. The notice cited my non-conforming Old World ornamental garden as a violation of Riverbend Farms Aesthetic Standards, Section 14.3. It demanded removal within 30 days. It assessed a fine of $150 per day until compliance. The fine totaled $4,500. The garden was Maeve's life's work. The bylaws cited did not apply to me. I burned the notice in the wood stove. Big mistake. People like Brielle Castor take silence as permission. The second compliance notice arrived in March by certified mail. This one was 4 pages and notarized. It cited 5 additional bylaw sections, none of which applied to my property, and assessed a cumulative fine of $9,700. It directed me to attend the upcoming HOA board meeting to begin the formal aesthetic compliance process. I responded the same week by certified mail of my own, with a 1-page letter and a 14-page packet of attachments. The letter was simple. It pointed out that my property had never been part of Riverbend Farms HOA. It enclosed a copy of my deed, recorded in 1953. It enclosed a copy of the original Riverbend Farms plat from 2009, which clearly excluded my parcel. It enclosed a recent survey from a licensed North Carolina surveyor, confirming that my property line ran exactly where it had run for 70 years. It enclosed copies of the developer's own correspondence from 2008. The correspondence acknowledged that the Vance parcel was a permanent inholding. It would never be subject to HOA jurisdiction. I delivered the letter myself to the Riverbend Farms HOA office on a Wednesday morning. The young woman at the desk read the cover sheet, raised her eyebrows, and offered me a cup of coffee. I accepted. Brielle Castor's response took 6 days. A bright orange sticker, 8 inches square, appeared on the cedar fence post at the head of my driveway. It went up sometime between Tuesday at midnight and Wednesday at 6 in the morning. Notice of non-compliance. Aesthetic violation. Enforcement action pending. The sticker had been applied with industrial contact cement. It took me 40 minutes and a heat gun to peel it off without damaging the cedar. The next monthly issue of the Riverbend Farms community newsletter was a glossy 12-page production Brielle wrote and edited herself. It contained a 1-page column titled, "When a Single Property Becomes a Drag on the Whole Community." The column did not name me. It did not need to. It described an unnamed elderly in-holding owner whose Victorian-style overgrown garden was depressing surrounding property values and increasing pest pressure on neighbors' professionally maintained landscapes. It accused the unnamed owner of being willfully out of step with modern community standards. I read the column twice on the porch with my coffee. I did not write a response. That Friday afternoon, Brielle's husband Hagen Castor knocked on my front door. Hagen ran a small State Farm insurance agency in Weaverville. He was a polite man, the kind who carries an extra business card in his breast pocket in case the conversation turns toward auto coverage. He stood on my porch with a casserole his wife had made and a soft, rehearsed smile. "Hollis, Brielle wants me to extend an olive branch. We're not your enemy. The community just wants to find a path forward." I thanked him for the casserole. I asked him whether he had read the deed and survey I had submitted to his wife's office. He admitted he had not. I invited him into the kitchen. I made him coffee. I laid the documents on the table. I walked him through them, line by line. It was the way I had walked junior bank examiners through their first audits. I used the calm, patient voice of a man trying very hard to give the other person every chance to choose the easier path. When I finished, Hagen Castor sat very still for a long moment. "Hollis, I am going to tell my wife to drop this. I would appreciate that. She doesn't always listen to me on community matters. I understand." He left the casserole. He left the conversation looking like a man who already knew his wife was not going to drop anything. 3 days later, the next certified envelope arrived. It was the official notice of an emergency board meeting. The Riverbend Farms HOA would vote to designate Lot 1A as Provisional Aesthetic Enforcement Jurisdiction pursuant to Article 14. Lot 1A was my property. There is no Article 14 in the Riverbend Farms bylaws. I read the notice twice on the porch with my coffee. Then I called my late wife's sister, Pearl Ridenauer, who has practiced estate and property law in Asheville for 36 years. She answered on the second ring. "Hollis, whatever it is, the answer is yes." Pearl Ridenauer drove out from Asheville the next morning with her paralegal Trevor Wickham and a thick brown leather portfolio that had belonged to her late father. Pearl had practiced property law in 3 western North Carolina counties since 1989. She had drafted my grandfather's will, my father's will, Maeve's will, and my own. The portfolio held photocopies of all 4. She read the emergency meeting notice once. She set it down on my kitchen table. She poured herself a cup of coffee and looked at me across the rim. "Hollis, there is no Article 14. There has never been an Article 14. We are going to attend the Tuesday meeting and let her watch herself try to vote a deed into existence. That Tuesday evening, Pearl, Trevor, and I walked into the Riverbend Farms clubhouse at 6:55 for a meeting that had been called for 7. Pearl was wearing a navy blazer and the small gold pin from her father's old Buncombe County Bar Association membership. She walked into that room the way I had once walked into a bank president's office, with a federal subpoena in my briefcase. There were 68 residents in the room. Brielle Castor sat at the head of the long table, with 3 other board members and a printed agenda. She did not stand when we walked in. "Mr. Vance, we did not expect you to attend." "Mrs. Castor, this is my counsel, Pearl Ridenour, of Ridenour and Associates. We attend in protest. Please proceed." What followed for the next 43 minutes was the most embarrassing public meeting I have ever attended on the wrong side of. Brielle read aloud from a fictitious section of the bylaws. She projected a slide deck claiming Riverbend Farms had historical aesthetic jurisdiction over all properties within view of the community amenities. She passed around a color photograph of my heirloom rose bed and called it an unkempt jungle of overgrown weeds. She referred to my late wife's reflecting pool as a stagnant water feature, posing a mosquito risk. Pearl took notes the entire time on a single yellow legal pad in steady, practiced cursive. When the floor opened for comments, Pearl Ridenour stood up in her navy blazer and spoke for exactly 4 minutes. She read the relevant deed language aloud. She read the developer's 2008 in-holding letter aloud. She read the 2009 plat map description aloud. She informed the room that any vote to annex my property would be void on its face under North Carolina property law. It would expose every board member who voted for it to personal liability for tortious interference with title. 41 of the 68 residents in the room stood up and walked out before the vote was called. Brielle held the vote anyway. The 4-member board approved the annexation by a vote of 3-1. The lone dissenter was a quiet man named Hart Anders, a retired aerospace engineer from 419 Mountain Laurel Lane. He looked across the table at Brielle and said, very evenly, "Madam President, this is going to ruin you." Pearl smiled into her notes. That weekend, 2 contractors came onto my property uninvited. The first was a surveyor, a young woman with a tilt level and a clipboard. Her dispatcher had told her she was doing pre-improvement measurements for a Riverbend Farms common area expansion. I greeted her on my front porch with my coffee and a copy of my deed. She apologized twice, packed up her tripod, and was gone within 20 minutes. The second was a landscape contractor named Ezra Foster in a white pickup with a magnetic Riverbend Premier Garden Designs decal on the door. Ezra was 40-something. He had the slightly nervous body language of a man who had been hired to do a job he was not entirely sure he was authorized to do. I gave him the same documents. He left. He also gave me a quiet piece of information before he drove off. "Mr. Vance, Mrs. Castor has been telling contractors for 2 years that she has aesthetic remediation authority over multiple properties at Riverbend. There's a couple over on Cardinal Lane. There's an older woman on the other side of the swim center. Both of them had their landscapes torn out the same way she's planning to tear out yours." Eulalia Brunswick, my closest neighbor, walked over the same evening with a tin of ginger cookies. She was a retired botanist who had been a friend of Maeve's for 30 years. She confirmed every word Ezra had said. 2 weeks after the board meeting, Pearl's daughter Camille was turning 36. She was the closest thing I had to a daughter of my own. She was a hospital administrator at Carolina's Medical Center in Charlotte. Her birthday party was a Saturday afternoon backyard cookout. Pearl and her husband had been planning it for 2 months. They wanted me to come down for the long weekend. I had not left the property for an overnight trip in nearly a year. Eulalia Brunswick promised to keep an eye on the garden and the house. Her own grandson Theo was 12 and had been begging to feed Maeve's old koi in the reflecting pool. The plan was that Eulalia and Theo would come over twice a day to water and feed, and I would be home Sunday evening. I left Friday morning at 9. I drove the 4 hours down to Charlotte. I held Camille for a long minute when I arrived, because she had Maeve's exact laugh and her mother's exact eyes. What happened on my property between Friday afternoon and Sunday morning, I would only piece together later. The footage came from cellular cameras Eulalia Brunswick had quietly installed on her own back fence 2 weeks earlier. Her grandson had bought them on Amazon for $48 and set them up himself. At 11 o'clock Friday morning, I was pulling onto Interstate 26 outside Hendersonville. At the same hour, A Bobcat S64 skid steer with a 4-foot bucket attachment was unloaded from a flatbed trailer at the head of my driveway. The operator was a man named Dwight Coker, an independent contractor out of Black Mountain. Brielle Castor had paid him $3,500 in cash that morning. Her verbal assurance was that the property was an abandoned aesthetic remediation site under HOA jurisdiction. By 11:30, Dwight Coker had crossed my front pasture and was sitting in the cab of the Bobcat at the edge of Maeve's heirloom rosebed. Eulalia Brunswick saw the equipment first. She crossed the property line with her grandson Theo at her side and her phone in her hand. She walked up to Dwight Coker's open cab door and asked him whether he had a signed work order from the property owner. He showed her a printed sheet on Riverbend Farms HOA letterhead, signed by Brielle Castor, listing the property as Lot 1A, Aesthetic Remediation Authorized. Eulalia told him, very calmly, that he was about to commit a Class H felony in the state of North Carolina. Dwight Coker hesitated for 1 full minute. That was when Brielle Castor's champagne Lexus turned into the driveway. She got out in white slacks and oversized sunglasses with a clipboard already in her hand. She walked up to Eulalia and Theo and asked them to please remove themselves from an active community improvement work site. Eulalia did not move. Brielle turned on Dwight Coker. "Mr. Coker, I have explained the legal authority. I have signed your work order. The owner is non-compliant and is currently absent from the property. You are paid in cash. Begin the removal." Dwight Coker pulled the Bobcat into the rosebed. Eulalia Brunswick had her phone up the entire time. In 93 minutes, Dwight Coker tore out the half-acre garden Maeve had built over 12 years. He bulldozed the heirloom rosebed first. He scraped the bluestone paths into a pile. He drove the bucket through the cedar arbor Maeve had built with her father. He pushed branches and Fraser fir into the reflecting pool until the pool was no longer visible. He flattened the herb beds along the south wall. Maeve had grown the lavender there. She made it into sachets she handed out at every wedding she had been invited to. Brielle Castor directed every minute of it from beside her Lexus. Eulalia Brunswick filmed every minute of it from 60 feet away. Theo, who was 12, watched and did not say a word. When Dwight finished, Brielle directed him to leave the debris in a single mound at the south corner of the lot for scheduled community removal next Tuesday. She paid him a $500 bonus for finishing on schedule. She got back in her Lexus and drove away. The Bobcat went back onto the flatbed at 2:18 in the afternoon. Eulalia Brunswick called my cell phone that evening at 6:30. I was sitting in Camille's backyard with a glass of bourbon in my hand and my reading glasses on top of my head. Eulalia did not say much. "Hollis, you need to come home. I am so sorry. I am so sorry." I drove home Sunday night with my reading glasses still on top of my head. Somewhere between Forest City and Hendersonville, the dark mountain air begins to smell like balsam and cold stone instead of Charlotte heat. I pulled into my driveway at 9:11 in the evening. I left the headlights on and got out. The garden was a 4-foot mound of churned mud and broken bluestone in the moonlight. I did not turn on a flashlight. I did not call anyone. I walked up to the place where the heirloom rosebed had been. I knelt down. I picked through the loose dirt with my hand. I found the brass plant marker Maeve had set in the center of the bed 28 years earlier. The marker said simply, "Rose, Kildare, 1928. I held it for a long time. Then I sat on a piece of bluestone the bucket had cracked in half. I stayed there until the moon moved twice across the corner of the cedar, where the arbor used to stand. I went into the house at 3 in the morning. I made coffee. I did not sleep. At 6 o'clock Monday morning, I called Tess Llewellyn. Tess had been my partner on the Rural Community Bank fraud desk at FDIC Atlanta for 14 years. She was now the regional fraud coordinator for the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation out of the Charlotte field office. We had not spoken in 3 months. I told her what had happened to the garden. I told her what Brielle Castor had been claiming about jurisdiction over my property. I told her, in the same calm voice I would have used to brief a federal prosecutor, what I believed I was looking at. A years-long embezzlement scheme dressed up as a homeowners association. Tess Llewellyn was quiet for 2 seconds. "Hollis, what do you need?" "I need to know whether a woman named Brielle Castor has ever opened a depository account using the name Riverbend Beautification Fund, or any variation thereof." Tess called me back at 7:23 in the morning. She had pulled the FDIC's depository account database, which lists every account opened at every insured institution in the United States. She had cross-referenced it against the Social Security number Brielle Castor had used on her insurance agency's NAIC registration paperwork. The paperwork had been filed publicly by her husband Hagen when he opened the State Farm office in Weaverville. Brielle Castor had a personal Wells Fargo business depository account. The account was titled Riverbend Beautification Fund, LLC. It had been opened in 2018. Over the next 6 years, it had received deposits totaling $288,400 from Riverbend Farms HOA homeowners. Outflows from the account had paid for her landscape design business overhead. They had paid for 2 family vacations to Hilton Head. They had paid $64,000 in tuition payments to Davidson College. They had paid 3 Lexus lease payments per year. The Riverbend Beautification Fund, LLC, was not a registered business with the North Carolina Secretary of State. It had never filed a 990 form. It had never appeared in any HOA financial report. Hart Anders, the dissenting board member, had never seen the account. The HOA board had been told, every quarter, that the beautification fund was being held in a restricted reserve account managed by the property management company. There was no property management company. Tess called me back a second time at 9 in the morning. Hollis. There's a similar account under her name for 2 other HOAs she manages. One in Henderson County, one in Madison County. Combined deposits across all 3 approached $760,000. I sat on my front porch with my coffee. The wind turned the broken cedar where the arbor used to be. Maeve's heirloom rose marker sat on the porch rail beside the cup. Tess, I said, I need to make some calls. Hollis, I'm coming up there. I'll be at your house by 3 this afternoon. I am bringing the IRS. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, my dining room had become a federal task force. Tess Llewellyn drove up from Charlotte in a Navy Crown Victoria she had borrowed from the FDIC pool. Behind her came Special Agent Annalise Renfrew of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. She was in plain clothes, carrying a small black laptop case and a thermos of coffee. Pearl Ridenour came up from Asheville with Trevor Wickham. Hart Anders walked over from his Mountain Laurel Lane house at 4 in a worn cardigan. He carried 3 cardboard file boxes. They contained every Riverbend Farms HOA quarterly board packet he had ever received as a board member. Eulalia Brunswick brought a tray of ham biscuits. Theo brought the cellular camera footage on a thumb drive. We worked at my dining room table until sundown. Tess Llewellyn pulled the bank records from all 3 HOAs, Riverbend Farms, Pinecrest Hollow in Henderson County, and Stone Ridge Bluff in Madison County. The pattern was identical at all 3. A beautification fund account opened in Brielle Castor's personal name. Quarterly deposits collected from homeowners through HOA invoicing. No corresponding line item in the audited HOA financials. No filings with the state. No 990 form. Total combined deposits across the 3 accounts, $763,800. Annalise Renfrew opened her laptop and pulled Brielle Castor's last 6 years of personal income tax returns. Mr. Vance, she said, the entirety of these deposits has been excluded from her reported income. We are looking at a willful tax evasion case stacked on top of the embezzlement. The IRS criminal threshold for willful evasion is $100,000 over 3 years. She is over that line by a factor of 7. Hart Anders went through the quarterly board packets one by one. He pointed at the Beautification Fund reserve balance line on each statement. Every quarterly report claimed the fund was being held in escrow at Mountain Trust Bank, Asheville. Mountain Trust Bank, Asheville does not exist. There is a Mountain Credit Union of Asheville. There is no Mountain Trust Bank. Hollis, Hart said quietly, she has been lying to us for 6 years. By 8 o'clock that evening, Pearl had drafted 3 things: a criminal complaint to the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office, a formal demand letter to the North Carolina State Banking Commission, a civil suit against Brielle Castor personally, and against the Riverbend Farms HOA, collectively, for the destruction of my property. By 9 o'clock, Tess had Sheriff Garth Pemberton on a video call from his home in Black Mountain. Garth Pemberton was a 58-year-old career sheriff who had been elected 4 times in Buncombe County. He had a reputation for not being intimidated by HOAs. He listened to Tess's summary for 11 minutes. He asked 4 questions. He looked into the camera. Ms. Llewellyn, I have wanted to arrest Brielle Castor for 2 years on a different complaint. What's the smartest way to do this so it sticks? I cleared my throat. I set down my coffee. I looked at the 7 people in my dining room. Folks, I said, The annual awards gala at the Riverbend Farms Clubhouse is 2 weeks from this Saturday. 240 homeowners will be in the room. The local press will already be there because the Chamber of Commerce sponsors a community service award. Mrs. Castor is scheduled to give her annual President's Address and to present herself with a Founder's Vision Award funded by her own beautification fund. The room was quiet for a moment. Tess Llewellyn smiled into her coffee. Hollis, you are about to make this woman's annual gala the best attended HOA arrest in the history of Buncombe County. Pearl pulled out her phone. She called her son Wesley Cardwell, the senior assignment producer for WLOS, the ABC affiliate in Asheville. Wesley listened to his mother for 90 seconds. He laughed once, the way only a producer laughs when the story walks itself onto the desk. Mom, I will personally drive the live truck. Hart Anders leaned forward. What do you need from me? Pearl looked at him over her bifocals. Hart, we need you to make sure Brielle does not change the gala agenda. We need her on that stage, giving that speech. Hart nodded once. Done. I poured the last of the coffee into Tess Llewellyn's cup. Folks, I said, 2 weeks. The 2 weeks before the Riverbend Farms annual awards gala were the strangest 2 weeks of my life. I tarped the destroyed garden the morning after Tess and Annalise left. The heavy blue contractor's tarp was weighted down with broken blue. Brielle Castor spent those same 2 weeks doing exactly what Tess had predicted she would do. 3 days after the bulldozing, a fresh Riverbend Farms HOA letter arrived in my mailbox. It informed me that the aesthetic remediation work on Lot 1A had been successfully completed by HOA-authorized contractors, at no cost to the property owner. It directed me to sign an enclosed waiver, releasing the HOA from any future claims related to the work. It also assessed an additional $1,200 for post-remediation inspection. I did not sign the waiver. 5 days after the bulldozing, a Buncombe County Sheriff deputy knocked on my door. He had been dispatched on a complaint from Brielle Castor, alleging that I had threatened her in a phone call. I had not. I do not have her phone number. The deputy was a quiet man named Greer Whitener, who had recently transferred from the Henderson County office. He looked at me, looked at the destroyed garden, and made a long, careful note in his report book before he drove away. 8 days after the bulldozing, Brielle Castor published the next monthly issue of the Riverbend Farms newsletter. It contained a victory column titled, Bringing the Last Holdout into the 21st Century. It included 2 color photographs of my flattened garden under the caption, Community Improvement in Progress. The article praised the board's decisive action and announced that the upcoming annual awards gala would feature the inaugural presentation of the Riverbend Founder's Vision Award. The Founder's Vision Award would be presented to Brielle Castor by Brielle Castor, in recognition of her tireless leadership in transforming Riverbend Farms into the premier community in western North Carolina. Hart Anders called me Tuesday morning before the gala. He had succeeded in his quiet assignment. The agenda for Saturday evening was unchanged. Brielle would deliver her annual President's Address at 7:15. She would present herself with the Founder's Vision Award at 7:40. The Chamber of Commerce Community Service Award would be presented at 8. WLOS would be filming the chamber portion live for the 10 o'clock news. Hart had also added one item to the agenda himself, with Brielle's distracted approval. At 7:05, the board would honor a longtime in-holding neighbor of the Riverbend Farms community for his decades of quiet contribution to the natural beauty of Settlers Creek. The longtime in-holding neighbor was me. Brielle had glanced at the agenda, signed off on it, and told Hart it was a good idea. She had thought it was a humiliation she was preparing for me. She had not understood that Hart Anders had been making sure I got into the room. By Friday evening, every other piece had quietly fallen into place. Tess Llewellyn and Annalise Renfrew were checked into the Hampton Inn in Asheville. Sheriff Pemberton had 2 unmarked cruisers and 4 uniformed deputies on standby in the parking lot of the Riverbend Farms Clubhouse. The North Carolina State Banking Commission had sent its deputy commissioner, a man named Lyle Tarbett, with a formal cease and desist order in his briefcase. Glennis Carmichael, of the state auditor's office, had driven down from Raleigh that afternoon. Wesley Cardwell had 2 camera operators and a satellite truck pre-positioned across the road. Pearl Ridenauer had drafted a 1-paragraph statement for me to read into a microphone if the moment seemed right. Eulalia Brunswick washed and pressed the navy suit Maeve had bought me for our last anniversary. Saturday evening at 6:53, I parked my old Ford F-150 at the back of the Riverbend Farms clubhouse parking lot. I sat for a moment with the engine off. I looked at the small brass plant marker Maeve had set in the heirloom rose bed in 1998. I had carried it in my coat pocket for 14 days. I walked into the clubhouse at 7 exactly. The clubhouse foyer smelled like fresh hydrangeas and white wine. Hart Anders met me at the inner door, in a charcoal suit and a thin red tie that did not quite match. He shook my hand. He did not say anything. He walked me into the main hall. 224 residents were already seated at round dinner tables of 8, in formal evening dress. The stage at the front of the room held a podium, a microphone, and 2 large floral arrangements. A projection screen showed the Riverbend Farms logo. A single tall acrylic award trophy sat on a small table behind the podium. Brielle Castor was at the head table to the left of the stage, in a long white dress with gold sequins on the bodice. She was talking to a man I recognized from the Chamber of Commerce when she saw me walk in. Her face did 3 things in quick succession. The first was a flash of confusion. The second was a quick, calculating glance at Hart Anders that said she had not expected this on the agenda. The third was a slow, theatrical smile, the kind a politician puts on when she has decided to absorb an unexpected event into her own narrative. She stood up. She walked across the room toward me. She took both of my hands. She said, loud enough for the front 3 tables to hear, "Hollis, welcome. We are so pleased you could join us this evening." I did not pull my hands back. I did not smile back. "Mrs. Castor, thank you." She returned to her seat. Hart Anders walked me to the second row. Pearl Ridenour was already sitting there in a navy blazer. The small gold pin from her father's old Buncombe County Bar Association membership glinted on her lapel. Eulalia Brunswick sat next to her, in the lavender dress she had worn to Maeve's funeral, with her grandson Theo on her other side. Theo was 12 and had insisted on coming. He was also holding the thumb drive with the bulldozing footage in his coat pocket. The Chamber of Commerce Master of Ceremonies opened the gala at 7:03. At 7:05, Hart Anders walked to the podium and read a brief introduction. He spoke for 90 seconds. He talked about the Vance family's history on Settlers Creek since 1953. He talked about my late wife's garden as one of the small wonders of western North Carolina. He thanked me, on behalf of the community, for being a quiet steward of the land for the last 71 years. 224 people applauded. Brielle Castor did not applaud. Her smile had begun to flatten at the edges. Hart Anders sat down. The Chamber of Commerce president made his remarks. The local realtor of the year was honored. A scholarship was announced. A young woman from the Riverbend Farms Golf Committee gave a 1-minute thank you. The fundraising drive had bought new netting for the driving range. At 7:14, Brielle Castor walked to the podium. She delivered her annual president's address from a printed script in a pale blue folder. She thanked the board. She thanked the volunteers. She praised decisive aesthetic action this past quarter that has elevated the visual standards of our community. She pointed, briefly and with a small smile, in my direction. 224 people followed her finger. I did not move. At 7:38, she finished her address. She turned slightly toward the small acrylic trophy behind her. "And now," she said, "I am pleased to present the inaugural Riverbend Founders Vision Award. This award recognizes the leader whose vision has most shaped our community's identity over the past decade. The board has selected, with great pride." The double doors at the back of the hall opened. Sheriff Garth Pemberton walked in first. Behind him came 2 uniformed Buncombe County Sheriff deputies. Behind them came Special Agent Annalise Renfrew of the Internal Revenue Service, in her IRS criminal investigation jacket. Behind her came Tess Llewellyn of the FDIC, Lyle Tarbett of the North Carolina State Banking Commission, and Glennis Carmichael of the North Carolina State Auditor's Office. The WLOS camera operator and Wesley Cardwell himself had stepped in just behind them. The room went silent, in the way only a room of 240 people can go silent. Brielle Castor was still holding the inaugural Founders Vision Award trophy in her right hand. I stood up. Sheriff Garth Pemberton walked the length of the center aisle in his Sheriff's Department uniform, with his hat tucked under his left arm. He stopped 6 feet from the podium. He looked up at Brielle Castor, who was still holding the trophy in her right hand and her speech in her left. "Mrs. Castor, I'm Sheriff Garth Pemberton, Buncombe County. I have a warrant for your arrest on multiple charges: embezzlement, obtaining property by false pretenses, willful destruction of real property, 3 counts of conspiracy. Special Agent Renfrew of the Internal Revenue Service has additional charges. Ms. Llewellyn from the FDIC has additional charges. Mr. Tarbett from the State Banking Commission has additional charges. Ms. Carmichael from the State Auditor's Office is here to seize the financial records of the Riverbend Farms HOA, effective tonight. Please set down the trophy and the speech, ma'am, and step away from the podium. Brielle Castor did not set down the trophy. She looked for a long second at the 224 people in the room. Then she looked at Hart Anders. Then she looked at me. The trophy slipped out of her hand. It landed on the carpeted stage and rolled off the edge. Special Agent Annalise Renfrew stepped forward. Mrs. Castor, I'm Special Agent Annalise Renfrew, IRS Criminal Investigation Division. I have a federal warrant addressing willful tax evasion. The amount in question exceeds $700,000 over 6 years. The federal charges will be processed after the state proceedings conclude. Tess Llewellyn was already at. Lyle Tarbett of the State Banking Commission stepped to a quiet woman at the corner table I had not noticed earlier. The woman was the Riverbend Farms HOA's official treasurer of record, a Mrs. Cordelia Sutter, who had also been deceived by Brielle for 6 years. Mr. Tarbett handed her a formal cease and desist order related to all HOA financial accounts and asked her to remain available for questioning. Glennis Carmichael of the State Auditor's Office walked across the front of the room with a single laminated document in her hand. She set the document on the podium beside Brielle's untouched script. The document was a notice of involuntary state audit. Wesley Cardwell's WLOS camera operator was filming everything. The second WLOS camera, mounted on a tripod at the back of the hall, was capturing the wide shot. Brielle Castor was placed in handcuffs at 7:43. The room had not made a single sound for 90 seconds. I walked from the second row to the podium. I did not look at Brielle. I did not need to. Pearl Ridenour handed me the 1-paragraph statement she had drafted earlier in the day. I unfolded it. I set it on the podium. I held the small brass plant marker that said Rose, Kildare, 1928 in my left hand, where every camera could see it. I read what Pearl had written. My name is Hollis Vance. I have lived on Settlers Creek for 63 years. My late wife, Maeve, built a memorial garden on our property over 12 years, by hand. She used stones she set herself and an heirloom rose her grandmother carried from County Cork in 1928. 2 weeks ago, the woman currently in handcuffs to my right ordered that garden bulldozed while I was at a family birthday in Charlotte. The garden was not on her property. The garden was not under her HOA. The bulldozer was paid for in cash. The money was stolen from this community over a 6-year period. The total exceeds $760,000. We will rebuild the garden. We will rebuild it with help from many of you in this room. And we will rebuild it as a public memorial garden, open to all of Riverbend Farms, in the name of every neighbor she stole from. Maeve would have wanted that. Thank you. I set the brass marker on the podium. I stepped back. The applause that started in the third row, slowly at first, became a standing ovation by the time it reached the back of the hall. Brielle Castor was led out the side door at 7:46. The trophy stayed where it had fallen. The federal indictment came down 16 weeks later. Wire fraud, mail fraud, embezzlement across 3 homeowners associations, willful tax evasion, conspiracy, transportation of fraudulent documents in interstate commerce. The state indictment was filed the same morning. Together, they totaled 47 counts. Brielle Castor pleaded out 5 months later. 60 months federal, 42 months state, served concurrently. Full restitution of $763,800 to the 3 affected HOAs. Permanent bar from any officer position in any North Carolina nonprofit. Her landscape design business surrendered its corporate charter. Her husband Hagen pleaded the following month to obstruction and accessory after the fact, lost his State Farm appointment, and quietly moved out of Mountain Laurel Lane. The Riverbend Farms HOA called a special election the month after the gala. Hart Anders ran unopposed. He won by acclamation. His first official act as president was to dissolve the Discretionary Beautification Fund. He replaced it with a 5-person rotating committee, whose every expenditure had to be publicly posted online. His second act was to mail every household a written apology for the 6 years of deception they had endured under the previous board. The 2 other HOAs Brielle had managed, Pinecrest Hollow and Stone Ridge Bluff, entered settlement agreements with their own communities within the year. Both reformed their governance. Both replaced their property managers. I received a personal civil settlement of $390,000 from the Castor liquidation. Most of it came from the forced sale of their home on Mountain Laurel Lane. I used every dollar of that settlement on one project. The Maeve Vance Memorial Public Garden was rededicated on the second Saturday of May, 18 months after the bulldozing. 310 people from Riverbend Farms and the surrounding communities turned up to help. Eulalia Brunswick led the design committee. Her grandson, Theo, now 13, planted the first new bluestone path with a small ceremonial trowel I had given him. The new heirloom rose was a cutting from the original county cork plant. Maeve's sister Pearl had taken it back to her own greenhouse the year Maeve received her diagnosis, in case the original ever did not survive. The garden is now permanently dedicated as a public memorial garden. It is open dawn to dusk, free to anyone in Buncombe County who wants to sit on the bench by the rebuilt reflecting pool. The cedar arbor was rebuilt by a local timber framer who refused payment after he learned the story. Pearl Ridenauer and I started something else too. The first Saturday of every September is now Maeve's Garden Day at the rebuilt site. We open the gate. We pull out the long tables under the dogwood. Pearl makes the cucumber sandwiches Maeve always made for her wedding receptions. Hart Anders runs the cider press. Eulalia runs the seedling exchange. Wesley Cardwell sometimes drives up with his kids. About 400 people have come through every September now. Last September, a kid about 10 years old asked me why somebody would bulldoze a dead lady's flowers. I told him the truth. I told him that some people use rules they make up themselves to take what doesn't belong to them. I told him the only way to stop it is to keep a clean record and do honest work, and to trust that there are still folks in this country who will bring a federal warrant when the moment requires one. If this story made you angry, drop a comment below with your own HOA nightmare. I read every one. If it made you smile, share it with somebody who needs to hear that the loud folks don't always win. And if you enjoy this kind of story, slow-built, well-prepared, and finished by people who refuse to give up, hit subscribe. The next one is about an HOA Karen who fined a Vietnam veteran $90 a day. His American flag flew over his late son's headstone. She claimed it was casting visual disturbance during sunset hours. The former JAG officer who lived directly behind him had been quietly photographing every notice for 14 months. I'll see you next week.
There's something about the way Bridget Vanderhoek operated that says everything about how this scheme survived. She didn't sneak. She didn't hide. She took out brochures, ads. She held public events. She printed her own logo on the side of the catering van. She was confident because nobody had ever stopped her. She assumed that the quiet old engineers down the road would stay quiet forever. What broke her wasn't the federal engines or the satellite truck or the highway-grade barricade gate. It was that Ted Redman had spent 30 years writing the rules she was breaking. She did not know what she did not know. She did not know that the man whose road she had been selling was the same man who had certified 2,000 miles of right-of-way in 5 Idaho counties. If a developer or HOA has ever tried to bulldoze your piece, your road, or your name, drop your story below. I read everyone. Hit subscribe because next week we're standing in the front yard of a deaf widower. In the morning, the HOA president told him the visual fire alarms had to come down. She claimed the lights reflected onto neighboring properties at night. The retired ADA compliance attorney 3 doors down had been quietly building her file for 6 months. Don't miss it.